What would you do if a single moment of compassion changed everything? Stay with us as we uncover how one farmer's choice echoed across the wilderness in ways he never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The first drops of rain struck Thomas McKenna's cabin roof like scattered pebbles, each one a warning of the deluge to come. He paused in his work, calloused hands gripping the handle of his worn axe as he listened to nature's growing fury. The woodpile beside his cabin looked pitifully small against the approaching Montana winter, but it would have to do. Everything on his homestead had to do. There was never enough of anything anymore. "Papa, is it going to be a bad one?" 8-year-old Sarah's voice drifted from the cabin's single window, her pale face pressed against the glass like a flower seeking sunlight. Thomas forced a smile he didn't feel. "Nothing we can't weather, little bird. You keep that fire burning steady while I bring in the last of this wood." The storm hit with the violence of a cavalry charge. Rain transformed from drops to sheets, to walls of water that seemed determined to wash his small piece of claimed land back into the wilderness. Thunder cracked overhead like God's own whip, and lightning turned the world into a series of stark, terrifying photographs. There the barn, there the fence line, there the grave marker where Margaret rested beneath the unforgiving earth. Thomas had just secured the last of his tools when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a blade through silk. Someone was knocking on his door. Not the tentative tap of a neighbor or the authoritative pound of a lawman, but the desperate, rhythmic hammering of someone fighting for their life. He hesitated, his hand frozen on the door latch. The frontier had taught him caution above all else. Strangers in the night often brought trouble trailing behind them like shadows, but another crash of thunder seemed to shake the very bones of his cabin, and the knocking grew more frantic. "Sarah, get back from the door," he called softly, then lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured their sanctuary. The woman who nearly fell into his cabin was like nothing he'd ever seen. She was clearly Native American, her long black hair plastered to her head by the rain, her buckskin dress torn and bloodied, but it was her eyes that stopped Thomas cold. Dark pools that held a depth of pain and dignity that made his chest tighten with recognition. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything just as he had. "Please," she gasped, her English careful but clear. "My child, she's sick. I need shelter, just until the storm passes." Thomas looked past her into the tempest and saw nothing but darkness and driving rain. No horse, no travois, no sign of the child she spoke of. His practical mind whispered warnings, but his heart, the heart that still ached for his own daughter's needs, made the choice for him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "Quickly now." The woman staggered inside, water pooling beneath her feet on Margaret's carefully maintained wooden floor. Sarah peered around the corner of their sleeping area, her blue eyes wide with curiosity and fear. "Sarah, bring one of your mother's old blankets," Thomas instructed, moving to stoke the fire higher. "And put the kettle on. We'll need hot water." As warmth began to fill the small space, the woman's shivering gradually subsided. Thomas studied her more carefully in the firelight. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with high cheekbones and skin the color of burnished copper. The blood on her dress appeared to be from thorns and rough travel rather than violence, but her exhaustion was bone deep. "Where is your child?" he asked gently, offering her a cup of hot coffee with hands that remained steady despite his uncertainty. The woman's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing a grief so raw it made Thomas's own loss feel fresh again. She's with the spirits now. 3 days ago, the fever took her." Sarah gasped softly from her corner, and Thomas felt his heart clench. He knew that particular hell, had walked through it himself when Margaret's cough had turned to blood, then to silence. "I'm sorry," he said simply, because there were no other words. "What's your name?" "Ayana." "It means eternal blossom in my people's tongue." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "A name full of hope for a world that offers little." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, an unexpected peace settled over them. Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, while Ayana slowly warmed herself by the fire. Sarah, initially shy, began to emerge from her hiding place, drawn by a curiosity stronger than her fear. "Are you really an Indian princess?" Sarah asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. Ayana's laugh was like water over stones, musical despite her sorrow. I am no princess, little one, just a mother who has lost her way. I lost my mama too, Sarah said solemnly. Papa says she's watching over us from heaven. Then we have much in common, you and I. As the night deepened, their conversation flowed like a gentle river. Ayana spoke of her people, the Crow Nation, and their struggles to maintain their way of life as more settlers pushed westward. She had been traveling alone, seeking a new place to rebuild her shattered life, when the storm caught her. Thomas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone since Margaret's death. Memories of their early days on the homestead, dreams they'd had for Sarah's future, fears that kept him awake at night, wondering if he was strong enough to be both father and mother to his child. You are stronger than you know, Ayana said quietly, as Sarah dozed by the fire. I see it in how your daughter looks at you. She has no doubt of your love, your protection. That is a rare gift. Some days I feel like I'm drowning, Thomas admitted, like this whole place is going to wash away and take us with it. The storm always passes, she replied, but what we do during the storm, that shapes who we become when the sun returns. Near dawn, as the rain finally began to soften, Ayana rose to leave. She moved like someone carrying invisible weights, each step measured and careful. Thank you, she said, pressing something small and warm into Thomas's palm, for seeing me as human when many would see only an enemy. Thomas looked down at the object in his hand, a small carved bird, smooth with age and handling. What is this? A promise, she said mysteriously, and a warning. Change is coming to this valley, Thomas McKenna. When it arrives, remember this night. Remember that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems forgotten. She paused at the door, turning back with eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than the mountains themselves. Your wife, Margaret. She would be proud of the man you've become, the father you are. Thomas's throat tightened. He'd never told her Margaret's name, and then she was gone, vanishing into the grey pre-dawn light like smoke dispersing in wind. Thomas stood in his doorway long after she'd disappeared, the carved bird warm in his palm and her words echoing in his mind. Sarah stirred by the dying fire, and he gently carried her to her bed, tucking her in with tender care. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of blue sky like promises of better days ahead. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Ayana's words carried more weight than simple gratitude. Change was coming. He could feel it in the very air, like the electricity that precedes lightning. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of sharing warmth with a stranger would soon echo across the entire territory, or that the carved bird in his hand would become the symbol of a choice that would test everything he believed about justice, mercy, and what it truly meant to be human in an inhumane world. The storm had passed, but its true impact was only beginning. 3 weeks passed before Thomas understood the true weight of Ayana's words. The carved bird sat on his mantle like a talisman, its smooth surface worn from his nervous habit of turning it over in his fingers during long evenings when sleep eluded him. Sarah had asked about it once, and he'd simply said it was a gift from their visitor. Some truths were too complex for 8-year-old minds to carry. The first sign of change came with the dust cloud on the horizon. Thomas was mending fence posts when he spotted it, a brown smudge against the clear autumn sky that spoke of many horses moving fast. His stomach tightened with familiar dread. In his 5 years on this land, riders in groups meant one of 3 things: cavalry on patrol, outlaws running from the law, or settlers fleeing from something worse. "Sarah," he called toward the cabin. "Come inside, now." His daughter's blonde head appeared in the doorway, but she didn't move with the urgency he'd hoped for. At 8, she still believed in her father's ability to protect her from anything. Thomas envied her that faith, even as he prayed he wouldn't fail it. The riders materialized from the heat shimmer like ghosts gaining substance. Thomas counted 15 men, their faces hard beneath wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting easy on their weapons. At their head rode a man Thomas recognized with a sinking heart, Jake Morrison, whose spread lay 20 miles south and who'd made no secret of his feelings about the Indian problem. Morrison was a big man who wore his prejudices like a badge of honor. His father had died in a Sioux raid back in Kansas, and Jake had spent the 15 years since painting every Native American with the same bloody brush. He'd built his ranch into one of the territory's largest operations through a combination of hard work, ruthless business practices, and a willingness to use violence when negotiations failed. "McKenna," Morrison's voice carried across the yard like a whip crack. "We need to talk." Thomas set down his hammer and walked slowly toward the group, keeping his hands visible and his movements calm. He'd learned long ago that sudden gestures around armed men were rarely wise. "Morrison, what brings you out this way?" "You know damn well what brings me." Morrison's pale eyes were chips of winter ice. "Word is you've been harboring Indians, giving aid and comfort to savages." Thomas felt his blood chill. "I don't know what you've heard, but don't lie to me." Morrison's hand dropped to his gun butt. "Ben Crater was riding the ridge 3 weeks back during that big storm, saw smoke from your chimney when it should have been banked for the night. Saw tracks the next morning, moccasin tracks leading away from your cabin." The other riders shifted in their saddles like wolves sensing weakness. Thomas recognized several faces, men from town who'd lost friends or family to various conflicts with the tribes over the years, men who'd let their grief ferment into something darker and more dangerous. "If someone needed shelter from the storm, I gave it," Thomas said carefully. "That's what civilized people do." "Civilized?" Morrison spat in the dirt. "Was it civilized when they butchered the Henderson family last spring? When they burned out the Kowalski place and took their youngest boy? We've been fighting a war out here, McKenna, and you've been giving comfort to the enemy." "It was one woman," Thomas found himself saying, though he immediately regretted the admission. She'd lost her child. She was grieving, alone. One woman today, a war party tomorrow. Morrison's voice rose to a shout. "You think they won't remember your kindness? You think they won't come back with more of their kind?" Thomas glanced toward his cabin, where he could see Sarah's face pressed against the window. Her world was about to change, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "What do you want, Morrison?" "I want you to understand something." Morrison leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting. "This valley is going to be civilized. We're going to build towns and schools and churches, and we're going to raise our children without fear of savage raids. Anyone who stands in the way of that progress, well, they might find themselves on the wrong side of civilization. Is that a threat? It's a promise." Morrison straightened, addressing his men as much as Thomas. "The territorial governor is sending troops to establish a permanent fort in the valley. They'll be here within the month. When they arrive, they're going to find a community united in purpose, or they're going to find examples of what happens to those who aren't." The riders wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust that made Thomas's eyes water. As they prepared to leave, Morrison called back one final warning. "Think about your daughter, McKenna. Think about what kind of world you want her to grow up in, because the old ways are dying, whether you help them along or not." Thomas stood in his yard long after the dust had settled, the carved bird seeming to burn against his chest, where he'd unconsciously pressed his hand. When he finally turned toward the cabin, he found Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale with questions she was too young to ask. "Who were those men, Papa?" "Neighbors," he said, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Just neighbors with different ideas about how folks should live." That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Thomas sat by his fire and stared into the flames. He thought about Margaret, about the dreams they'd shared of building something good in this harsh land. He thought about the woman who'd appeared in his doorway 3 weeks ago, carrying her grief like a stone in her chest. He thought about the carved bird and its maker's cryptic words about change coming to the valley. Most of all, he thought about Morrison's threat and what it meant for a man trying to raise a daughter alone in a world that seemed determined to choose sides in a war he wanted no part of. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters like skeletal fingers. In the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that could have been mourning or warning, depending on how you chose to hear it. Thomas McKenna sat by his fire and wondered if kindness was truly never wasted, or if some acts of decency were simply too dangerous for the world to allow. By morning, he would have his answer. The riders who had left his homestead that afternoon were already spreading word throughout the valley. By sunset, every settler within 50 miles would know that Thomas McKenna had given shelter to an Indian woman. By midnight, some would be calling him a traitor to his own kind. And somewhere in the darkness beyond his firelight, forces were already moving that would test not just his convictions, but his very survival. The storm Ayanna had warned him about was about to break, and this time, No amount of warm shelter would be enough to weather what was coming. Dawn came grey and cold to the McKenna homestead, bringing with it a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Thomas had barely slept, his mind churning through possible scenarios like a mill wheel grinding grain. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made him reach for the rifle that now lay across his knees, and every whisper of wind through the pines sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Sarah sensed the change in him immediately. At breakfast, she pushed her cornmeal mush around her bowl without eating, her blue eyes darting between her father's tense face and the windows he kept glancing toward. "Papa, are we in trouble?" Thomas forced his voice to remain steady. "Not trouble, little bird, just complications. Sometimes grown folks disagree about things, and it takes time to sort them out." What kind of things? How could he explain to an 8-year-old that their simple act of Christian charity had branded them as enemies in some people's eyes? How could he tell her that the same frontier that demanded self-reliance also demanded absolute conformity to unwritten codes of survival? "Finish your breakfast," he said instead. "We might have visitors today." The visitors arrived with the morning mist, but they weren't the armed riders Thomas had expected. Instead, a single wagon rolled into his yard, driven by Dr. Samuel Harrison from the town of Cedar Falls. Beside him sat his wife, Emma, her face set in lines of determination that Thomas recognized as the expression of a woman preparing to do something her husband considered unwise. Dr. Harrison was a small, neat man who'd come west to escape something. Debts, Thomas suspected, or perhaps a scandal back in whatever civilized place had spawned him. But he was a good doctor and a decent man, qualities that often existed independently of each other on the frontier. "Thomas," Dr. Harrison called as he climbed down from his wagon. "We need to talk." Thomas emerged from his cabin with Sarah close beside him, noting how Emma Harrison's eyes immediately went to his daughter with an expression of protective concern. "Doctor, Mrs. Harrison, what brings you out this early?" "You know what brings us." "Doctor." Harrison removed his hat, running nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "The whole territory's buzzing about what happened here 3 weeks ago. Jake Morrison rode into town yesterday evening, and by midnight, half the settlement was ready to form a citizens' committee." "A committee for what?" Emma Harrison stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. "To deal with Indian sympathizers and threats to community safety." Those were Morrison's exact words. Thomas felt his world tilting slightly. "And what do you think about that, Doctor?" "I think Morrison's a fool whose hatred has poisoned his judgment," Dr. Harrison said bluntly. "But I also think you've put yourself and your daughter in terrible danger. For showing Christian charity to a grieving woman, for forgetting that charity and survival don't always walk the same path." Emma's voice carried surprising steel. "Thomas, we've known you since you first claimed this land. We baptized Sarah, we mourned Margaret with you, we've watched you build something good here. But Morrison has turned your kindness into evidence of treason. What exactly are you telling me?" Dr. Harrison glanced around nervously, as if expecting armed riders to emerge from the tree line. "There's going to be a town meeting tonight. Morrison's calling it a community discussion about security. But everyone knows what it really is. They're going to demand you either publicly denounce what you did and pledge to report any Indian activity in the area, or what? Or they're going to declare you a threat to community safety and take action accordingly." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot. Thomas looked down at Sarah, who was listening with the intense concentration children brought to conversations they sensed were important but couldn't fully understand. "What kind of action?" Emma Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "The kind that ends with you losing this land or worse." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "Are you here to warn me or to convince me to run?" "We're here," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "to offer you a way out. My brother has a medical practice in Denver. He needs an assistant, someone reliable who can help with the books and basic care. It's honest work, and Sarah could attend a proper school." "You're asking me to abandon my home." "I'm asking you to save your daughter's life," Emma said sharply. "Thomas, you don't understand what's building here. The territorial governor isn't just sending troops to build a fort. He's given local militias authority to pacify hostile elements as they see fit. Morrison's been appointed as a deputy territorial marshal. He has legal authority now." Thomas stared at the woman who'd been one of Margaret's closest friends, trying to process what she was telling him. Legal authority to do what? Whatever he deems necessary for community safety. The implications crashed over Thomas like a cold wave. Morrison hadn't just been making threats, he'd been backed by territorial law. The frontier's rough justice was about to become official policy. How long do I have? The meeting's tonight, Dr. Harrison repeated. If you're going to leave, it needs to be now, today. We can take Sarah with us, keep her safe while you decide what to do. Thomas looked down at his daughter, who was staring up at him with complete trust. She believed he could protect her from anything, solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. The weight of that faith was almost unbearable. Sarah, go inside and gather your things, just the important ones, your mother's Bible, the quilt she made you, anything that won't take up much space. Are we going on a trip, Papa? Maybe, little bird, we'll see. As Sarah ran toward the cabin, Thomas turned back to the Harrisons. If I run now, Morrison wins. Every decent person in this territory will know that showing mercy is enough to destroy a man's life. And if you stay, you'll be destroyed anyway, Emma replied. At least if you run, you'll live to fight another day. Will I? Or will I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when the past will catch up with me? Dr. Harrison placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. Sometimes there are no good choices, my friend. Only choices you can live with. Thomas walked to his fence line and stared out over the land he'd claimed, with nothing but hope and determination. Every fence post represented days of back-breaking labor. Every cleared field was a victory won with sweat and blood. This wasn't just his home. It was his legacy, the foundation he'd planned to build Sarah's future on. But what good was a legacy if his daughter didn't live to inherit it? He was still standing there when the second group of riders appeared on the horizon. This time Thomas counted at least 30 men, and the dust cloud behind them suggested more were coming. At their head rode Jake Morrison, and even at this distance, Thomas could see the badge glinting on his chest. It's too late, Doctor, Harrison said quietly. They're not waiting for the meeting. Thomas felt the carved bird pressing against his chest and remembered Ayana's words. Change is coming to this valley, Thomas McKenna. When it arrives, remember this night. The change was here, and with it, the moment of reckoning he'd somehow known was inevitable from the moment he'd opened his door to a stranger in the storm. Emma, take Sarah and get her out of here, he said quietly. Thomas, no, come with us. They'll follow. They won't stop until they've made their point. He turned to face the approaching riders, his hand dropping unconsciously to the rifle at his side. But they're going to discover that some points cut both ways. Papa, Sarah's voice called from the cabin doorway, her small satchel clutched in her hands. Thomas McKenna looked at his daughter one last time, memorizing her face, and made the hardest choice of his life. Go with Mrs. Harrison, little bird. Papa has to take care of something first. The riders were close enough now that he could see Morrison's grim smile, could count the weapons they carried, could feel the weight of their collective anger pressing against him like a physical force. But he could also feel something else, a strange calm that settled over him like morning mist. He'd spent 3 weeks wondering what price his kindness would demand. Now he was about to find out. The carved bird seemed to pulse against his chest like a heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of drums. The riders formed a semicircle around Thomas's cabin, like wolves preparing to close on wounded prey. Jake Morrison dismounted slowly, his new badge catching the morning light, his hand resting on his gun butt with practiced ease. Behind him, 30 men sat their horses in silence, their faces masks of grim determination. Thomas stood alone in his doorway, the rifle across his arms but not yet aimed. In the distance, he could see Dr. Harrison's wagon disappearing into the tree line with Emma and Sarah aboard. At least his daughter was safe. Whatever happened next, she would live to see another sunrise. McKenna! Morrison's voice carried across the yard like a judge pronouncing sentence. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I'm placing you under arrest for giving aid and comfort to hostile Indians. What's the charge exactly, Morrison? Sharing coffee with a grieving mother. The charge is treason against your own kind. Morrison stepped closer, his pale eyes bright with something that might have been satisfaction. But I'm prepared to be reasonable. Renounce what you did. Admit it was a mistake born of weakness, and pledge to report any Indian activity in this valley. Do that, and maybe we can find a way to let you keep your land." Thomas felt the carved bird pressing against his chest and heard Ayana's voice in his memory. Kindness is never wasted, even when it seems forgotten. He thought of his daughter's trusting eyes, of Margaret's gentle insistence that they treat all people with dignity, of the woman who'd stood shivering in his doorway, carrying grief too heavy for any human heart to bear alone. "No," he said simply. Morrison's face darkened. "No, I won't renounce showing mercy to someone who needed it. I won't pretend that kindness is weakness, and I sure as hell won't pledge to hunt down people whose only crime is being born with different-colored skin." A murmur ran through the assembled men, some approving, others angry. Thomas could see the division in their faces, the uncertainty that meant not everyone had come here convinced of Morrison's cause. "Then you've chosen your side," Morrison snarled. "Boys, burn him out. Let's show this valley what happens to Indian lovers." But before anyone could move, a new sound drifted across the morning air, the rhythmic thunder of many horses approaching fast. Thomas turned toward the sound and felt his heart stop. Coming over the ridge like something from a fever dream, at least 100 Native American warriors rode in perfect formation. But these weren't the painted war party of settler nightmares. They rode in ceremonial dress, their weapons sheathed, their faces painted not for war but for something else entirely. At their head rode a woman Thomas recognized immediately, though she looked transformed from the broken, grieving figure who'd sought shelter in his cabin. Ayana sat her painted horse like a queen, her buckskin dress now adorned with intricate beadwork, her long hair braided with feathers and silver. Beside her rode an older man whose presence radiated authority, clearly a chief or war leader of significant importance. Morrison's men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands dropping to weapons, but the sheer number of approaching riders made any thought of resistance academic. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. "What the hell?" Morrison began, but his words died as the Native American formation came to a perfect halt just outside rifle range. Ayana raised her hand, and one of the warriors behind her lifted a long staff adorned with eagle feathers and strips of hide. But instead of a war cry, what emerged was something entirely unexpected. A song. Dozens of voices joined in harmony, creating a melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself, ancient and powerful, and strangely peaceful. When the song ended, Ayana urged her horse forward alone, stopping directly in front of Thomas. Her dark eyes held depths he couldn't fathom, but there was no mistaking the gratitude that shone in them. "Thomas McKenna," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "3 weeks ago you opened your door to a stranger in the storm. You shared your fire, your food, your shelter. You asked for nothing in return. You saw not an enemy, but a human being in need." She reached into a beaded pouch at her side and withdrew something that glinted gold in the morning light. "For this kindness, the Crow Nation declares you brother. For this mercy, we offer you the protection of our people. For this courage, we name you friend." She held up the golden object, a medallion of some kind, intricately carved with symbols Thomas didn't recognize but somehow understood. Around them, the tension began to shift as Morrison's men realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Furthermore," Ayana continued, her voice rising so all could hear, "let it be known that any man who raises his hand against Thomas McKenna raises it against the Crow Nation. Any man who threatens his family or his land threatens our families and our land. We have spoken this promise before our ancestors and our children. It will not be broken." The older chief urged his horse forward and spoke rapidly in his native tongue. Ayana listened, then turned back to Thomas with something that might have been a smile. "Chief Two Bears wishes me to tell you that the Crow people have watched this valley for many seasons. We have seen which settlers take only what they need and which take everything they can reach. We have seen which men treat the land with respect and which see it only as something to be conquered. You are among those we would call friend, regardless of the color of your skin." Morrison found his voice at last, though it cracked slightly. "This is still American territory. Your people have no authority here." Ayana's gaze shifted to him, and Thomas saw something cold and calculating in her expression. "Do we not? The treaty your government signed with ours grants us hunting and travel rights throughout this region. We are here legally, Deputy Morrison." "Are you?" She gestured toward the men behind Morrison, many of whom Thomas now realized weren't official deputies at all, but simply armed settlers bent on vigilante justice. "I think," she continued, "that the territorial governor would be very interested to know that men claiming official authority have been threatening law-abiding citizens with violence, especially when those citizens are under the protection of a sovereign Indian nation." The political implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. The territorial government was already walking a tightrope between settler demands for protection and federal pressure to honor existing treaties. An incident involving the wholesale intimidation of a citizen under tribal protection could bring federal investigators, congressional hearings, and the kind of attention that ended political careers. "This isn't over," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No," Ayanna agreed. "It is not, but it has changed." She turned back to Thomas and held out the golden medallion. "Will you accept this gift, Thomas McKenna? Will you be brother to the Crow?" Thomas looked at the medallion, then at the faces surrounding him, Morrison's men uncertain now and beginning to drift away, the Native American warriors, still and patient as statues, Ayanna herself, no longer a broken woman seeking shelter, but a leader offering alliance. He thought of Sarah, safe now but still needing a future in this harsh land. He thought of Margaret and the dreams they'd shared of building something good and lasting. He thought of the choice that had started it all, the simple decision to offer warmth to someone cold, shelter to someone lost. "I will," he said, and took the medallion. The moment his fingers closed around the carved gold, the waiting warriors erupted in celebration, not war cries, but sounds of joy and welcome. Feathers and dust flew as horses danced, and men called out in their native tongue. Morrison and his remaining followers retreated without another word, their mission transformed from triumph to humiliation in the space of a heartbeat. As the celebration continued around him, Ayanna guided her horse closer to Thomas. "The storm you sheltered me from was nothing compared to the one that was coming for you today," she said quietly. "But storms pass, and the sun always returns. How did you know? We watch, we listen, we remember those who show us kindness." She smiled, and for a moment she was just the grieving woman who'd stood dripping in his doorway. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, we get the chance to repay it. That evening, as Thomas sat by his fire with the medallion warm in his palm, he heard familiar voices outside. Dr. Harrison's wagon rolled into his yard, carrying Emma and Sarah home. His daughter flew into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt something like peace settle over his small homestead. "Is it over, Papa?" Sarah asked, her small hands patting his face as if to make sure he was real. "This part is," he said, holding her close. "But Sarah, remember this day. Remember that doing right isn't always easy, but it's always worth doing. Remember that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems like the whole world is against you." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the distant sound of celebration from the Crow camp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of what it meant to be human in an inhumane world. But tonight, Thomas McKenna sat by his fire with his daughter in his arms, the golden medallion of brotherhood warm against his chest, and knew with absolute certainty that he had chosen correctly. The storm had passed, the sun had returned, and in this small corner of the vast frontier, justice had found a way to bloom like flowers after rain. In the distance, a wolf howled, but this time it sounded like a song of triumph.